Discussing today's robotics seminar, Ames from Caltech, he spoke about why learning needs control. His case is for control theory to be attached to the robotics problem in a sense that you can have analytic solutions to safety through traditional control methods on top of the learning which happens in modern robotics systems. And the reason for that is that you cannot afford to have problems, mistakes, things along those lines, because of humans. Society will not accept these robots. That's his general thesis. And my point here is I want to critique this. So I'm not going to talk too much about his actual work. I'm going to put some papers in the show notes. But I'm going to do two things. I'm going to roughly explain his work on a sort of more big picture scale, and then I'm going to critique it. And the critique is the following. The critique that I have is, in my opinion, safety is a learning problem. Safety is not a control problem. So to use this type of terminology is actually, it's misrepresenting the actual situation, or it's giving people the illusion of control. What I mean by that is that when we have any kind of system, any machine, whether it's robotics or rockets or cars, or for that matter, Wall Street banks, for example, the concept that we actually control risk and that we have control over the system is a fallacy. And actually in the financial markets, it's led to very bad outcomes. So therefore, I would say it is more useful for the community to actually look at it as a learning problem from the get-go, and then decide how this learning problem is going to be solved. And the difference between a control problem and a learning problem is twofold. One is the learning problem has probabilistic outcomes at its core, so you're accepting the fact that outcomes can have variance. But more importantly, second, the learning problem puts the necessity to find the right data and train the model to get better in the forefront. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's May 31st, 2024. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is down 40 basis points. The market's up 80 basis points for the year. We are down 10%. The market's up 10.5%. We're underperforming by 20.5%. So Aaron Ames from Caltech, he is a traditional engineer. He's a robotics guy, but I would say in the nomenclature of today, he would be better described as an engineer. And the reason I say that is because of his title, why machine learning or why robotics could use, or excuse me, why learning could use some control. I think that's roughly the title. And what he means with that, in a nutshell, is that you can layer the robotics problem in different ways. For example, you can have an algorithm which learns how to influence the actuators of the robot, and then you have a control layer on top of that has some barrier functions, which in plain English just means there's a certain line you don't cross. He mentions Isaac Asimov, who has the three pillars of safety in control theory, which is number one, you never hurt a human. Number two, you do what you're supposed to do. And number three, you protect yourself. So those are good guidelines. But again, I think there's a bit of a risk of misleading. I'm not saying that Aaron is misleading us by any means, but I feel like some of the older guard, particularly the older guard in the robotics departments, whether it's here or whether it's in other places, they are sticking to their old control theory type approaches. And I find that understandable, but it's not very helpful, because you have a natural inclination, if you're a control person, to see the world as deterministic, to see the world as closed-end solution to a problem. And I disagree with that. I think opening the problem up as a learning problem, again, gives researchers, gives people in the industry also an excuse to deal with with variance outcomes that aren't perfect, and also puts the onus on finding the right data, working on the data set. How do I train the machine that actually delivers the goods? So let me now explain what he does and then go a little bit deeper in my critique. So Aaron Ames is in the business of building robots, in particular walking robots. And the way he does that is by having a set of functions that control actuators that actually make the robot move. And what's happened in the last 10 years with the advent of machine learning and AI is that more and more of those control functions, those matrices which control the actuators, they are not explicitly programmed, but they're learned. So software 2.0, full self-drive, end-to-end learning, all of these things are just different nomenclatures for the same thing, which is we develop algorithms that learn from data. He's okay with that. Of course, he's on board with that. Nobody's questioning that. But where he tries to add value is by saying, how do we ensure safety? And we can ensure safety by adding a safety layer, by making sure that the robot never crosses a certain function, which is called a barrier function. In plain English, that means, for example, you will never get closer than 2 inches to a human. So assuming you can identify a human, you will just never get closer to 2 inches. It doesn't matter what the story is here. It doesn't matter what the circumstances. And that's already where I see the big flaw, right? And you have this problem of unintended consequences that I would like to illustrate with an example. For example, you could have this hard-coded rule, never get closer than 2 inches to a human. And now a car is driving at 30 miles an hour, and a human steps out, and the car follows the rule, steps on the brakes dramatically, doesn't hit that human which stepped out, but in the process kills one of the passengers in the car because of the abrupt stop, right? So you have a rule, don't harm anybody, and yes, you didn't harm X, but you harmed Y. So you can see, I mean, this is at a grand scale, we've seen this same problem. I don't know if there's a word for this, but the same problem, which is, let's say, when governments do so-called safety measures, whether it's, during the pandemic, or whether it's, I don't know, when the hurricanes hit or stuff like that. And then we have, let's say, lockdowns or we have roads get closed, or 9/11 calls aren't taken anymore for safety reasons or whatever. And then while you're saving certain people's lives and certain people's circumstances get better, other people's get worse. So the problem of safety is a learning problem because it's a complex problem and it doesn't have a closed-end solution. And that's my point. I think I would like to formulate the problem like a learning problem for 2 reasons. One is I want to start with the premise of variance in the outcome. So it's not something that we pretend that doesn't exist, or even worse, that we sort of point out to the machine learning crowd and say, well, you guys are probabilistic people. We're the engineers here. We are deterministic, right? This would be terrible because there is no such thing. But more importantly, I think, again, the onus should be on the data. Anything that anybody does, as far as I'm concerned, in engineering going forward, has to start with the question, what's the model and what's the data? You build the machine that solves the problem. You don't solve the problem directly. And in the case of safety, like I was just trying to explain, there is such a thing as the trolley problem. And I think trolley problems are everywhere. There's the canonical trolley problem, which is the problem of a trolley going down a track, and there's a person that can change the direction of the track. And the question is, if the trolley keeps going on the same track, it's going to kill 1 person. And if you change the direction, it's going to save that person's life, but kill, let's say, 3 other people. So what do you do? What do you do? You're that, you're changing tracks. You're in charge of changing tracks for the trolley. What do you do? That is the canonical trolley problem. And it's a hard problem. And I don't think that any kind of engineer building self-driving cars or humanoid robots should be solving this problem from the get-go. Certainly not. It's too hard. However, having been driving with full self-drive Tesla 12.4, I believe it's now, having been driving for over 2 months now, I feel like there's trolley problems everywhere, all the time. Not as dramatic. It's not about life and death, but still, there are trolley problems, like the problem I just explained. Like the car, for example, stops right away when there's a person approaching a crossing. And that could lead to risks that are maybe even worse than if the car just kept going. Because particularly in the case of a crossing, you might think, well, the pedestrian sees the car coming. You don't have to actually stop. And if you stop, you could, again, endanger your passengers or the people behind you and so on and so forth. So there's lots of trolley problems that, in my opinion, are not solved. And I think that's why safety is a learning problem. The other example I would like to bring up as a sort of case study is the study of law enforcement. For example, let's take a human law enforcement officer that walks into a fight, right? There's a fight between two people, law enforcement officer comes in. And let's assume that law enforcement officer is following the Isaac Asimov doctrine, don't hurt anybody, do what I say, and protect yourself, right? Now, that person, there's two types of law enforcement officers. One is trained in neutralizing people through jiu-jitsu, and the other isn't. So the one that isn't should then just do nothing and let the two people fight, which could be an outcome that is desirable, but isn't it better to have a law enforcement officer that can actually intervene, neutralize the aggressor, and stop the fight without hurting somebody? So what I'm trying to get at here is that takes some learning. And I think my conclusion here, what I'm really trying to get through is, instead of trying to talk about control, how about we formulate the problem from the get-go as a learning problem, and then find the right ways to train whether the robot or the car or whatever, just call it the robot, train the robot to increase the safety or get some sort of Pareto optimality in safety. Because again, we can't have absolute safety. Safety is a relative problem, always has been, whether it's in banking, whether it's in rocket science, whether it's in the military, or wherever you look. Whenever people do things, in particular, when they make decisions under uncertainty, by definition, there is no such thing as absolute safety or control. So formulating I think safety is a learning problem. Formulating it as such opens up the avenue to have better probabilistic approximations to the Pareto optimality, and most importantly also having a quest for the best data and model architecture to increase the safety profile of the machine. Thank you.